In 1991, 7-year-old Emily Jensen vanished from her bed in a quiet Milwaukee suburb, leaving behind a baffling mystery and a grieving family. Her bedroom window was cracked open, but there were no signs of struggle, no footprints, no evidence, just an empty bed and a few scattered toys. 9 years later, her mother, Diane, stumbled across one of those toys while sorting through boxes in the attic. She pressed a button, and what played next would change everything. Emily's voice, whispering something no one had heard before. A long-buried secret was finally coming to light. The morning of September 14th, 1991, began like any other for Diane Jensen. She woke at 6:30 a.m., started the coffee, and tiptoed down the hallway to wake Emily for school. But when she opened her daughter's bedroom door, the sight in front of her didn't make sense. Emily's bed was empty. The sheets, still tucked in, were barely disturbed, as if no one had slept in them. Her favorite stuffed bear sat upright near the pillow. The only oddity was the window. It was pushed open a few inches, the curtain caught in the light breeze. Diane's heart dropped. She ran outside, calling her daughter's name, her voice breaking into panic within minutes. By 7 a.m., she had called 911. The police responded quickly. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints that didn't belong, no neighbors reported hearing anything unusual. Emily had gone to bed at 8:30 the night before, after a routine night of homework and brushing her teeth. Her room was on the second floor. The only way in or out, if not through the locked front door, was that bedroom window. For months, investigators canvassed the neighborhood. Flyers went up on telephone poles and in shop windows. News reports showed Diane and her husband, Tom, in tears, pleading for any information. But leads dried up fast. There were no known enemies, no custody disputes, no ransom notes. Emily had simply disappeared. By the time winter arrived, hope had started to harden into grief. Tom, never able to cope with the uncertainty, left in early '93. Diane stayed in the same house, unable to let go, convinced Emily might still come home one day. Over the years, she held on to every birthday card, every photograph. But she stopped going into Emily's room. She sealed it off, closed the door, and left it just the way it was the night Emily vanished. And for nearly a decade, that room, like the mystery, remained untouched. It was a Saturday in late October of the year 2000 when Diane Jensen finally cracked open the door to Emily's room. 9 years had passed, and in that time, grief had become a quiet, dull ache in Diane's life. Something she lived with, not something she talked about. The neighborhood had changed. New families had moved in. Most of them didn't even know there had once been a little girl who went missing from the tan house on the corner of Maple and Rose. Diane had learned to smile again. She volunteered at the local library. She made tea at 7 p.m. every night and kept to a quiet, predictable life. But Emily's room remained sacred, untouched, preserved. That morning, Diane had gone into the attic to find some old winter clothes to donate. While sifting through boxes marked Tom, Tools, Kitchen, and Photos, she saw it. A cardboard box with faded marker that read Emily Toys. She stared at it for a long time before reaching out. Something had shifted in her lately. Maybe it was turning 50. Maybe it was watching her sister's daughter graduate high school. Maybe it was just time. For the first time, Diane felt a strange pull, not to remember, but to make peace. She brought the box down and carried it into Emily's room. The air inside was still, but not cold. The curtains were drawn, the pink wallpaper slightly faded. Emily's bookshelf still held the Berenstain Bears, Charlotte's Web, and her sticker-covered diary, locked. But Diane had long ago found the key and tucked it into her jewelry box. Everything was in place. But as Diane knelt down and opened the box of toys, she didn't expect anything more than a few tears. Inside were the pieces of a childhood frozen in time, a plastic tiara with one gem missing, crumpled crayon drawings, a worn-out Barbie, a pair of glittery dress-up shoes, and at the bottom, her Fisher-Price talkback recorder. It was a chunky red and yellow device shaped like a miniature boombox with a green microphone and big, colorful buttons. Emily had carried it everywhere for nearly a year, recording silly songs, pretending to be a radio host, making secret spy messages. Diane smiled. The thing probably didn't even work anymore. She pressed the blue play button on instinct. Nothing happened. Then, just as she was about to set it down, a soft click. A burst of static. And then, "Mommy, he's at the window again." Diane froze. She stared at the recorder in her hands like it had come alive. The voice, Emily's voice, was faint but unmistakable. Her tone wasn't playful. It wasn't one of the silly, chirpy recordings Diane remembered. It was low, whispered, nervous. Diane pressed the button again, rewound, played it over. "Mommy, he's at the window again." No date, no other words, just that single terrifying sentence. Her fingers trembled as she pressed every button, desperate for more. She shook it, rewound it, played it again. But the device only held that one snippet. The battery light flickered weakly. It was old tech, likely recorded over many times. But this recording somehow had survived. She sat on the carpet for over an hour, trying to remember if Emily had ever said anything like that. Had there been someone? A neighbor? A delivery man? A visitor? She tried to convince herself it was just a game. Maybe Emily was pretending. Maybe it was a ghost story she was telling into the recorder, like she sometimes did after watching something she wasn't supposed to. But Diane couldn't let it go. The tone was too real, too scared. And those words, again. That meant it had happened before. A memory surfaced, something small. Emily once told her, "I don't like the man with the hat." Diane hadn't thought much of it at the time. Kids had vivid imaginations, and no one on their street wore a hat, at least not that she could recall. But now, Diane found herself back in that headspace, back in the panic of 1991, wondering what she'd missed, what the police had missed. She called the toy manufacturer first, Fisher-Price's customer service number. She explained she had a very old talkback recorder that had a snippet of audio she needed to extract. The rep was polite, even concerned, but explained they didn't support products that old and had no way of recovering anything from it. The device recorded on a small internal chip, not cassette tape, something early digital, almost impossible to extract without specialty tools. Diane hung up and stared at the toy. Next, she called the Milwaukee Police Department. At first, the officer on duty didn't understand what she was saying. But once she mentioned her daughter's name, Emily Jensen, the line went quiet. Diane was transferred to a cold case detective named Brian Mendez. "Mrs. Jensen," he said, "we haven't forgotten your daughter. We just haven't had anything new." "I think I do now," Diane said. "It's a recording, on her old toy. I don't think anyone ever heard it before." She played it over the phone. Mendez didn't speak during the playback. When it ended, he said, "Can I come by tomorrow?" Diane nodded, forgetting he couldn't see her. "Yes," she said, "please, come anytime." She hung up the phone and sat on the edge of Emily's bed. Everything felt heavier now. The room, the silence, the old dolls watching from the shelf. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat in the living room, the recorder on the coffee table, staring at it like it held the key to everything. She played the clip over and over, and each time her mind filled with questions. Who was he? Why had he been at the window before? Why hadn't Emily said something, really said something? Or had she? And Diane had simply failed to listen. The next morning, Detective Mendez arrived just after 8 a.m. He was in his early 40s, kind but sharp-eyed, with a notepad already in hand. He listened to the recording 5 times. He asked if Diane had ever mentioned a man hanging around the house, or if Emily had ever acted afraid of anyone in particular. "No," Diane said. "I mean, maybe. There were things. But I never thought they meant anything." Mendez nodded. Mrs. Jensen, this is enough to reopen the case. I'll need to take the recorder. I'll also need to ask you some tough questions. Things you may not want to remember." Diane nodded slowly. "If it helps find her," she said, "I'll remember anything you need." As he left with the toy in an evidence bag, Diane stood in the doorway and looked out across the street. The same houses, the same sidewalks, the same mailboxes. But something had always been wrong here. And now, for the first time in 9 years, someone had finally pressed play. The following days moved slowly, each hour stretched thin by anxiety and fragile hope. Detective Mendez had promised to keep Diane updated, and true to his word, he called her that Wednesday morning. "We cleaned up the recording," he said. "There's background interference, but the main voice is clear. It's definitely Emily. Our audio tech thinks it was recorded late at night, maybe just hours before she went missing." Diane clutched the phone tightly. "Is there anything else?" "A whisper," Mendez said. "Just before she says, 'He's at the window again,' we think she says a name. It's hard to make out. Maybe Don or Doug. We're enhancing it." Diane sat down slowly on her couch. "I don't know anyone named Don." Mendez paused on the other end. "You might have. I've been pulling names from the original investigation. I found a Donald R. Albrecht. Used to live 3 houses down. Retired electrician. You listed him as a friendly neighbor. Your daughter used to play in his backyard sometimes." Diane blinked. The name triggered something. An image from a backyard barbecue. A tall man, soft-spoken, with a gray mustache and button-up shirts. Don Albrecht. "Yes, he was kind," Diane said. "We had him over a few times. He helped fix our porch light." Mendez was quiet for a moment. He moved about 6 months after Emily disappeared, claimed he was retiring to Door County. His name came up in the original file, but there were no red flags, no prior arrests, no complaints. No one remembered seeing anything suspicious. Diane stood, pacing now. "You think he had something to do with this?" "I don't know yet," Mendez replied, "but I think we overlooked him, and I'd like to talk to him again." By Friday, Mendez had tracked Albrecht to a quiet retirement community north of Green Bay. Diane didn't ask how he managed to arrange the visit, but she knew he was going up in person. She didn't expect the call to come that night. "We spoke," Mendez said, his voice lower than usual. "He remembered you, remembered Emily, said all the right things. But then, when I asked if he ever watched Emily from her window, he said something odd." Diane felt her throat tighten. He said she liked pretending, always making up stories. Then he asked if the toy still worked. Diane didn't say anything. Mendez went on. "It's not a confession, but it's enough for a search warrant. He had a small property in Milwaukee before he moved up north, a rental house on East Parkway Drive. We're searching it tomorrow. Technically, it's still in his name." Diane felt something shift in her chest, a sensation somewhere between fear and certainty. The next day she asked if she could come to the search. Mendez hesitated but ultimately agreed, on the condition that she stay outside during the process. She drove herself, heart thudding the entire way. The house on East Parkway was a single-story, faded brick structure with boarded-up windows. According to county records, it hadn't been rented in years. There were old newspapers piled on the porch, weeds curling up through the cracks in the concrete. Diane stayed in her car, parked across the street, watching as uniformed officers moved in and out. Hours passed. Then a sudden rush of movement. A large tarp brought out. A forensics van pulled closer. Mendez walked out, removed his gloves, and crossed the street to Diane's car. She rolled the window down before he could speak. "We found something in the basement," he said quietly. "A locked panel in the wall. Inside were several items. One was a pink hair clip." Diane's hand flew to her mouth. "We're sending it for DNA confirmation," Mendez said. "But based on the photographs we've reviewed, we're nearly certain it's Emily's." Diane couldn't breathe. She opened the door and sat on the curb, her legs trembling beneath her. Was she there? Mendez shook his head. No remains, but there's more. We found a journal, Albrecht's. The last entry is dated September 13th, 1991. Diane looked up at him, wide-eyed. It reads, Mendez continued, she says she saw me. That she'll tell her mom. I didn't mean to scare her, I just like watching. I'm careful. She talks into that silly toy, but I doubt it records much. Still, I have to be careful. Diane stared ahead, her face pale. The sidewalk blurred in her vision. She did try to tell me? She whispered. She did, Mendez said softly, in the only way a child her age could. The next few days were a whirlwind. Forensics confirmed the hair clip belonged to Emily. Several other small items found in the basement, a shoelace, a child's drawing folded into a book, were all connected to her. The discovery reopened the case in full. Donald Albrecht was arrested at his retirement home, initially on suspicion of child abduction. He refused to speak beyond saying, "I don't remember anything." But the evidence was overwhelming. Detectives believe Albrecht had been watching Emily for months, from his home and during visits to the Jensens. He likely entered through the window while she was asleep, just as he'd fantasized in his journals. Whether his intent was to abduct or simply observe, no one could say for sure. What was clear, though, was that Emily had noticed and had tried to speak up, and no one listened. Not in time. Diane sat in her living room, the recorder placed on the table beside her. She no longer played it. She didn't need to. Instead, she stared out the front window, watching as autumn leaves danced down the street, the same way they had the morning Emily vanished. She thought about all the times Emily had tried to say something. The man with the hat, the nervous glances, the clinging hugs. How many parents had missed signs like that? How many children had tried to warn the world, only to be ignored? She didn't cry. Not yet. There was still more to do. She had agreed to testify if needed. She would face Albrecht in court if it came to that. But privately, when no one was looking, Diane spoke to her daughter's photo on the mantel. "I heard you, baby," she whispered. "I finally heard you." Because in the end, Emily hadn't vanished without a trace. She'd left behind her voice. And in that voice, buried inside a plastic toy no one thought to check, was the truth. The question now wasn't whether justice would come. It was how many others were out there, small voices still waiting to be heard. In the weeks that followed Albrecht's arrest, the case of Emily Jensen became front-page news across Wisconsin. The once cold file had ignited public attention, especially after local reporters caught wind of the unlikely discovery, a long-lost recording from a plastic toy revealing a decades-old secret. Diane, for her part, found herself torn between painful vindication and emotional exhaustion. She didn't want to become a symbol. She didn't want media crews outside her door. But she understood the importance of the moment. Emily's voice had broken through a silence that had suffocated them both for years. Still, there were questions left unanswered. Too many, in Diane's opinion. Detective Mendez had been careful with her, but she could see it in his eyes. There were pieces of the puzzle he still couldn't quite fit together. If Albrecht had taken Emily and he hadn't harmed her in the house on East Parkway, then what happened after? Why had there never been a body? Why had he kept such careful souvenirs, yet never spoken a word? "I don't think this was just about watching," Mendez had told her in one of their final meetings. "I think he acted out of fear. Emily saw him. She named him, maybe even more than once. It's possible he panicked, that something went wrong." Diane had replayed that possibility over and over in her head. What if Emily had confronted him? What if she told him she was going to tell her mother? Would that have been enough to drive a man like Albrecht to silence her? Then, 10 days after the search of the rental house, Mendez called again. "We've found a secondary property," he said. "A hunting cabin, about an hour outside of Manitowoc. It's registered under his cousin's name, but we cross-referenced bank statements. He's been paying utilities on it quietly for years." Diane's breath caught. "I want to search it," Mendez said. "This might be where it happened." The cabin was surrounded by thick woods, nestled at the end of a winding gravel road. It had no internet, no cell service, no neighbors within half a mile. If Albrecht had wanted somewhere to hide, something or someone, this was the place. Diane didn't go with them this time. She waited by the phone, staring at it for hours, barely sipping the tea that had long gone cold in her hand. When Mendez finally called, he didn't have to say anything. His voice alone told her, "We found what we believe are human remains in a shallow grave about 20 yards from the cabin," he said. "They were wrapped in a blue blanket with cartoon stars." Diane closed her eyes. "I need to ask," she said quietly. "Was she hurt?" There was a long pause. "No signs of prolonged trauma," Mendez replied. "Forensic pathologists will have the full report, but it appears to have been sudden, possibly asphyxiation." A wave of nausea hit her. She stood up, moved to the sink, and gripped the counter to steady herself. "She was only 6, she whispered. "I know," Mendez said, his voice tight. "I'm sorry." The DNA results came within the week. It was her. Emily had been found, buried beneath pine needles and soil, only an hour from home. That night, Diane didn't sleep. She didn't cry either. She sat at the edge of Emily's bed, the pink wallpaper faded to a dusky blush, the recorder still resting on the pillow where she'd left it. She remembered the night Emily went missing, how quiet it had been, how her daughter had gone to bed with her favorite blanket, that same one now recovered from the grave. Diane had assumed Emily was curled up in it when she vanished. She hadn't been wrong. In the morning, she made a decision. She visited the house on East Parkway one more time, accompanied by Mendez. She didn't want to go inside. She didn't need to. But she stood outside the front window, looking at the thick ivy climbing the bricks, the dust on the sill, the faint outline of where curtains had once hung. She said, "He's at the window again," Diane murmured. But it wasn't her window, was it? Mendez glanced over. "We believe he may have watched her from this property, or even from the rental across the alley. The layout makes it possible." Diane turned her head slowly, scanning the line of sight between this house and her own from memory. It made sense. Emily had seen him once, maybe more. "Did he ever say why?" she asked. Mendez shook his head. "He refuses to talk. Not a word since the arrest." "Coward," Diane said. There was no anger in her voice, just something cold. Final. Emily's funeral was held on a crisp November afternoon. The church was filled with people, some who had known her, some who hadn't, teachers, neighbors, former investigators, and strangers who had followed her story. The pews overflowed with quiet mourners, holding candles, tissues, and one another's hands. Diane didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her daughter's photo, set on a white easel framed in soft pink and gold, said everything. The image had been taken just a week before she disappeared, at a fair holding a cotton candy and laughing. The recorder was not brought into the service, but it was buried with her. Later that week, Diane walked through her neighborhood alone. The wind had picked up, leaves skipping across the sidewalk. It looked almost exactly as it had in 1991, save for a few new fences and paint jobs. On instinct, she turned down the alley behind East Parkway, stopping where the chain-link fence ended and the view opened to where her kitchen window once glowed late into the night. She stood there, watching the empty space between the houses. It was a narrow gap, a shadowed corridor of privacy, and it had been enough. She walked home in silence, her hands tucked into her coat sleeves, her pace slow but steady. The truth no longer weighed down on her. It followed quietly, like a memory that no longer hurt to carry. Emily had not vanished. She had been taken. She had not been forgotten. She had been heard. Diane looked up at the sky as dusk settled in. One star appeared, then another. "Sleep well, baby girl," she whispered. And with that, the long night ended. The trial of Donald R. Albrecht began 6 months after Emily Jensen's remains were recovered. It took place in a modest courtroom in Milwaukee County, the same city where Emily had once skipped down sidewalks and rode her pink bike in the summer sun. Now, her name echoed from the lips of prosecutors, witnesses, and journalists who filled the gallery, no longer as a question but as a truth being laid bare. Diane sat in the front row every day. She never missed a session. She wore the same small gold locket around her neck each time, the one with Emily's school photo sealed inside. Her posture remained stiff, composed, but her hands were always folded tightly in her lap, white-knuckled, not from fear, not even from rage, but from the sheer weight of waiting for the world to finally call this what it was, a crime, not a mystery. Albrecht, now 71, pled not guilty. His defense argued memory loss, confusion, and circumstantial evidence. They claimed there was no definitive proof he had taken Emily, let alone harmed her. His attorneys painted him as a frail, lonely retiree with a muddled past, not a predator, not a killer. But the prosecution had what mattered: the voice, the whisper, the name Dawn, captured forever in the plastic shell of a child's toy. The audio was played for the courtroom, not dramatized, not enhanced, just raw. Just Emily's tiny voice saying, "Mommy, he's at the window again." You could feel the shift in the room the moment it played. Silence fell like a curtain. Jurors leaned forward. A court officer quietly wiped his eyes. That single sentence, 9 seconds of sound, cut through the defense's careful arguments. And then came the evidence. The journal from the East Parkway home. The entry dated the night before she vanished. The hair clip, confirmed through DNA. The blanket she was buried in. The untouched items long hidden that placed Emily unmistakably in Albrecht's orbit. But what sealed it wasn't forensic. It was Diane. She took the stand on the 3rd day of the trial. She wasn't emotional. She didn't cry. Her voice was steady, like someone who had already lived through the worst part and now had nothing left to fear. "I always thought I missed something," she said. "But now I know she tried. She told me. I just didn't hear her in time." The jury deliberated for only 4 hours. Guilty on all counts: kidnapping, unlawful confinement, and second-degree murder. Though he received a life sentence, Albrecht showed no reaction. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, hands unmoving. No remorse, no explanation, no closure. And yet for Diane, the verdict was enough. She didn't want answers anymore. She had the truth. In the months after the trial, Diane returned to a quieter life. She declined all national interviews. She didn't want a book deal. She didn't want to be the mother of the girl with the toy. She wanted to return to being simply Diane Jensen, librarian, aunt, friend, and always Emily's mother. But something inside her had changed. The silence that once filled her house now had a different shape. It wasn't emptiness. It was calm. She began working part-time at a local nonprofit that focused on missing children. She spoke with parents who had just begun their nightmare, offering them something simple and rare: understanding. Not platitudes, not distant sympathy, but the voice of someone who had walked through hell and returned with something to hold on to. She also began writing letters to Emily. Each one started the same. "My sweet girl." She wrote about the trial, the things she wished she'd said in court, the way the jurors looked when they heard the recording, the way her legs shook walking up to the witness stand. She wrote about the funeral, the flowers, the music, the stranger who left a hand-drawn card with Emily's name spelled out in stars. She wrote about the past, too, about the night Emily lost her first tooth, about the time she danced barefoot in the kitchen to Whitney Houston, about the day she was born, how tiny her fingers were, and how loudly she cried. Diane kept the letters in a box under her bed. She never reread them. They weren't for her. They were for Emily. 1 year after the conviction, Diane stood at a small, polished headstone nestled under a maple tree in Forest Hollow Cemetery. The sky was pale blue, the kind that always reminded her of early spring mornings before school. She brought fresh flowers, white tulips, Emily's favorite. The headstone read simply, Emily Rose Jensen, 1984 to 1991. She was loved. She was heard. Diane knelt down and ran her fingers over the engraved letters. She took a slow breath and closed her eyes. "I never stopped looking," she whispered. A breeze moved through the trees above, carrying the rustle of leaves across the cemetery. "You saved yourself," she said softly, "with your own voice." The Emily Jensen case changed the way local law enforcement handled cold cases involving children. A new initiative was formed in Milwaukee County to re-examine evidence from cases predating digital archives. One of its central protocols was a rechecking of recovered personal items, especially toys or recording devices, for overlooked clues. In 2002, legislation was introduced in Wisconsin under the name Emily's Voice Act, which provided grant funding for the technological recovery of audio from analog or early digital toys and devices in active and cold investigations. It passed with bipartisan support. Across the country, other families of missing children began checking old boxes in attics and garages, just in case something had been missed. In a few rare cases, recordings or clues emerged. Nothing as clear as Emily's, but enough to rekindle dormant investigations. Diane never claimed credit. She didn't want to. But one afternoon, she received a letter. No return address. Inside was a short note written in blue ink. "Because of you, I found a voice I forgot I had. My daughter is still missing, but I found something she left behind. Thank you. M." Diane folded the letter carefully and added it to Emily's box. She no longer believed that closure meant forgetting. It meant listening. And sometimes that's all a child needs, to know that their voice, no matter how small, might one day be heard. How many times do we dismiss a whisper as imagination, a fear as childish nonsense, a warning as just a phase? Emily's story is a painful reminder that sometimes the smallest voices are speaking the loudest truths. Are we listening?